"Ma'am, economy boarding is down the hall." The flight attendant said it loud enough for nearby passengers to hear, and the laughter that followed was soft, polished, and cruel. But what Madison Reed didn't know was that the quiet woman clutching a worn Navy envelope was less than 24 hours away from owning the airline beneath their feet. The private terminal at JFK glowed beneath warm amber lighting, its marble floors reflecting the polished shoes of executives, celebrities, and wealthy travelers preparing for overnight flights to Europe. The scent of espresso and expensive perfume drifted through the lounge, while low jazz music hummed through hidden speakers overhead. Men in tailored suits rolled designer luggage behind them. Women wrapped in cashmere coats sipped champagne beside floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the runway. Then Claire Bennett walked in wearing faded jeans, white sneakers with worn soles, and a gray cardigan that looked several years old. Her 8-year-old son Ethan held tightly to her hand, while carrying a small dinosaur backpack with one broken zipper hanging open. The contrast was immediate. Heads turned. Conversations paused. Not because Claire was loud, but because she looked completely out of place among the polished wealth surrounding her. Claire kept her eyes forward as she approached the premium boarding desk, her posture calm despite the weight of judgment pressing from every direction. Around her neck hung a thin silver chain with an old wing-shaped pendant resting against her sweater. The metal looked scratched with age, almost worthless to anyone who didn't know what it represented. Ethan tugged gently on her sleeve. "Mom, are we really flying on this plane?" he whispered, staring through the glass toward the massive aircraft waiting outside beneath the rain-soaked runway lights. Claire smiled softly and brushed a strand of blonde hair behind her ear. "We are, sweetheart." Before they reached the scanner, Madison Reed stepped directly into their path. At 41, Madison had perfected the elegant smile wealthy passengers expected from a senior international flight attendant. Her Navy uniform looked immaculate. Beneath the terminal lighting, every strand of blonde hair pinned perfectly into place. But her eyes moved quickly over Claire's faded clothes, Ethan's cheap backpack, and the old duffel bag resting against Claire's shoulder. And instantly, something cold settled across her expression. "Ma'am," Madison said with rehearsed politeness, "economy boarding is through Gate C." Claire blinked once. "Oh no, we're boarding flight 22 to London." Madison extended her hand slowly. "Boarding pass." Nearby passengers pretended not to stare while openly listening. Claire handed over the passes quietly. Madison scanned them once, then again, confusion flickering across her face before irritation replaced it. "Business class. Front cabin. Row 2. Ethan noticed the change immediately. "Mom, did we do something wrong?" he asked softly. Claire squeezed his shoulder. "No, baby." Madison forced another smile, thinner this time. "Well," she said carefully, "these seats are usually reserved for our premium members." A man standing nearby chuckled into his coffee. A woman in diamonds glanced at Claire's sneakers and smirked openly. Claire remained calm. "I understand," she replied gently, "but those are our assigned seats." Madison's eyes drifted toward the navy envelope tucked beneath Claire's arm. Thick paper, gold trim, one corner slightly bent. An embossed wing insignia shimmered briefly beneath the terminal light before Claire adjusted her grip and covered it again. Madison noticed it but dismissed it instantly as legal paperwork or some outdated document. "Very well," Madison said at last, stepping aside with obvious reluctance. "Enjoy your flight." But her tone carried no warmth at all. Claire thanked her quietly and guided Ethan toward the jet bridge while whispers followed behind them like smoke. Probably upgraded with points. Or someone made a mistake. No way she belongs in business class. Ethan walked close beside his mother as they entered the aircraft, his sneakers squeaking softly against the carpeted aisle. The business cabin glowed with luxury. Wide leather seats stretched beneath soft gold lighting. Crystal glasses sparkled beside folded linen napkins. A flight attendant poured champagne for a silver-haired couple near the front, while another passenger scrolled through stock charts on a tablet worth more than Ethan's entire school tuition. Claire moved carefully through the cabin, aware of every glance following her. Madison appeared again beside row 2 before Claire could place her bag down. "Excuse me," she interrupted smoothly. "I'll need to verify these seats one more time." This time several passengers openly stared. Claire paused, then handed over the boarding passes again without complaint. Madison inspected them longer than necessary. Interesting, she murmured. You booked very late. Claire nodded once. Yes. Madison tilted her head slightly. Business class on this route can run close to $11,000 per seat this time of year. The implication hung heavily in the air. Ethan lowered his eyes toward the floor. Claire felt it immediately. The shame. The confusion. The small silent hurt children feel when adults decide they are less valuable than everyone else in the room. But Claire only smiled faintly at her son before answering. I'm aware. Madison handed the passes back slowly. Of course. As Claire settled Ethan into the seat beside the window, the navy envelope slipped partially from beneath her arm and landed briefly on the leather cushion. For less than a second, the gold lettering became visible. Board Authorization Agreement. Madison caught only a glimpse before Claire calmly tucked it away again beneath her cardigan. But something about the insignia made Madison hesitate. It looked familiar. Very familiar. Then the boarding door began to close, and the moment passed. Madison straightened her jacket, pushing away the strange feeling crawling at the back of her mind. In her experience, wealthy people announced themselves immediately. They wore status openly. Watches, jewelry, confidence, entitlement. Not faded jeans and tired sneakers. Certainly not mothers carrying broken children's backpacks. No, Madison told herself as she walked back toward the galley, watching Claire from the corner of her eye. People like her didn't belong in cabins like this. And before the flight reached 30,000 feet, she intended to make sure everyone understood it. The cabin doors sealed shut with a soft hydraulic hiss as rain streaked across the oval windows beside the aircraft. Outside, runway lights shimmered against the wet tarmac like blurred gold ribbons stretching into the dark New York night. Inside the business cabin, however, everything remained warm, polished, and controlled. Crystal glasses clinked softly. Leather seats reclined with quiet electric hums. A man near the front loosened his silk tie while reviewing market reports on his laptop. Another passenger discussed a real estate acquisition loud enough for half the cabin to hear. And in the middle of all that polished luxury sat Claire Bennett in a faded gray cardigan, carefully helping her son buckle his seat belt while trying not to draw attention to herself. Ethan stared wide-eyed at the glowing control panel beside his seat. Mom, he whispered, this chair moves by itself. Claire smiled softly. Pretty fancy, huh? He nodded excitedly before lowering his voice again. Are people mad we are here? The question landed harder than he realized. Claire glanced around the cabin. Some passengers quickly looked away when they noticed her noticing them. Others did not bother hiding their judgment at all. She had seen those looks before. In restaurants, hotels, school meetings, charity events. The quiet assumption that modest clothes meant small importance. That calm people could not possibly belong in expensive places. Claire brushed Ethan's hair gently behind his ear. Sometimes people decide things too quickly, she said softly. That does not mean they are right. Across the aisle, Madison Reed continued preparing the pre-departure service with sharp, efficient movements. But every few seconds, her eyes drifted back toward Claire. Something about the woman irritated her beyond logic. Maybe it was the calmness. Maybe it was the complete absence of embarrassment. Most passengers who accidentally wandered into premium cabins acted nervous, apologetic, eager to explain themselves. Claire did none of that. She simply sat there quietly, as if she belonged. Madison approached with a silver tray, carrying champagne flutes. Her smile immediately brightened as she stopped beside an older couple in designer clothing. Welcome aboard, Mr. and Mrs. Calloway. It is lovely to have you with us again. She handed them champagne personally before turning toward Claire and Ethan. The smile faded almost invisibly. Would your son prefer apple juice instead? She asked. The wording was subtle, but the meaning was not. Champagne for the wealthy adults. Juice boxes for the woman in sneakers. Claire noticed it immediately. So did the couple across the aisle. Ethan looked up at his mother uncertainly. Claire answered calmly. Water would be perfect, thank you. Madison nodded once, almost stiffly. Of course. Several minutes passed before the water finally arrived. By then, every other passenger in the cabin already had drinks, warm towels, and menus placed neatly before them. Ethan quietly watched as Madison laughed warmly with another family 2 rows ahead, while completely ignoring Claire's side of the aisle. The difference was impossible not to notice. A young businessman seated nearby leaned toward Claire slightly. "You know," he said under his breath, "they usually reserve these seats for frequent executive members." Claire looked at him politely. "I see. Nothing personal," he added quickly, though it clearly was. "It is just an exclusive cabin." Claire gave a small nod and returned her attention to Ethan. The businessman seemed almost disappointed that she refused to argue. Madison returned carrying menus bound in dark leather covers. She handed one carefully to every passenger in the row ahead before pausing beside Claire. "Unfortunately," she said smoothly, "we are running low on some premium dinner selections tonight." Claire accepted the menu with both hands. "Thank you." Madison's eyes dropped briefly toward Claire's old duffel bag resting near her feet. The zipper was slightly frayed. A tiny stitched name tag on the side read Ethan in fading blue thread. Madison tilted her head almost sympathetically. "International business travel can be overwhelming if you are not used to it," she said quietly. "If you need help understanding the service process, please let me know." Ethan looked confused. Claire only smiled faintly. "I think we will manage." Madison nodded, though her expression suggested otherwise. As she walked away, two women seated nearby exchanged subtle glances. One leaned toward the other and whispered something that caused both of them to smirk behind raised wine glasses. Ethan noticed again. Children always noticed. He lowered his eyes toward his lap and traced one finger across the edge of his tray table. Claire watched him silently for a moment before reaching into her cardigan pocket and pulling out a small packet of crackers. "Emergency snack?" she asked softly. Ethan smiled immediately. "You remembered." "I always remember." The tension in his shoulders eased slightly. Claire opened the crackers for him while the cabin lights dimmed into soft amber tones preparing for departure. As she leaned forward, the silver pendant around her neck slipped free from beneath her sweater again. The wing-shaped emblem caught the cabin light for just a second. This time a flight attendant working farther down the aisle noticed it too. His eyes narrowed briefly with recognition before he quickly looked away. Claire calmly tucked the pendant back beneath her collar without a word. She had spent years learning how to survive rooms exactly like this. Rooms where wealth announced itself loudly. Rooms where kindness often depended on appearance. But what made Claire different was not money. It was patience. She never rushed to prove herself because life had already taught her something powerful. The people most obsessed with status usually revealed their character long before anyone else revealed their bank account. Up front, Madison opened the manifest on her service tablet once more. Her eyes stopped again on Claire Bennett's name. No elite loyalty profile. No visible executive status. Last-minute booking. Yet somehow seated in one of the most expensive cabins in commercial aviation. Madison frowned slightly. Something about it still bothered her. Then her attention drifted toward the navy envelope partially visible beside Claire's seat pocket. Thick paper. Gold insignia. Legal authorization markings. Not ordinary. Documents. Madison stared a moment too long before quickly composing herself again. Still, in her mind, there had to be a simple explanation. Because women dressed like Claire Bennett did not buy seats in cabins like this. And they certainly did not carry themselves with that kind of quiet confidence unless they were hiding something. The aircraft finally pushed back from the gate as Manhattan disappeared beneath sheets of rain outside the windows. Engine vibrations rolled softly through the cabin floor, while the overhead lights dimmed into a calm golden glow designed to make wealthy travelers feel relaxed and important. A soft chime echoed overhead as the plane began taxiing toward the runway. Around Claire Bennett, expensive watches reflected the amber lighting while passengers settled into cashmere blankets and noise-canceling headphones. The atmosphere carried that unmistakable first-class confidence, the quiet understanding among privileged people that they belonged exactly where they were. And sitting in the middle of it all, wearing faded jeans and a worn cardigan, Claire looked like a mistake no one had corrected yet. Madison Reed continued moving through the aisle with polished efficiency, but her attention kept drifting back toward row 2. She could not explain why the sight of Claire bothered her so much. Maybe because wealthy passengers usually performed wealth. They displayed it proudly through designer luggage, luxury jewelry, and entitled behavior. Claire displayed none of those things. She simply sat quietly beside her son, helping him color dinosaurs in a cheap activity book while completely ignoring the judgment surrounding her. That calmness unsettled Madison more than arrogance ever could. The seatbelt sign switched off with a soft ding, and immediately the cabin came alive again. A silver-haired businessman across the aisle loosened his cufflinks while requesting a rare whiskey. Two women in tailored cream-colored suits discussed an art auction in Geneva. A young hedge fund manager complained loudly about market volatility while scrolling through stock updates on his phone. Then one of the women glanced toward Claire and lowered her voice. Just enough to make the cruelty feel intentional. Honestly, she murmured to her friend, airlines are lowering standards everywhere now. Her friend followed her gaze toward Claire's sneakers and gave a small laugh behind her wine glass. I thought premium cabins were supposed to feel exclusive. Neither woman addressed Claire directly. They did not have to. Ethan heard every word anyway. Claire noticed his small shoulders tense beside her. Slowly, she reached over and squeezed his hand beneath the blanket. Do you want to see the clouds after takeoff? She asked softly. Ethan nodded quietly. Madison approached again, carrying hot towels on a silver tray. Her smile returned immediately for the passengers ahead. Mr. Holloway, welcome back. We prepared your preferred bourbon for later. Ms. Davenport, your gluten-free meal has been confirmed. Then she stopped beside Claire. The warmth disappeared almost instantly. Ma'am, she said politely, though her tone carried a sharp edge underneath. We do ask passengers to maintain certain cabin standards during overnight international service. Claire looked up calmly. I am sorry. Madison's eyes lowered briefly toward Ethan's small backpack resting partly in the aisle. Personal belongings should remain fully stored during premium service. Claire quietly moved the backpack beneath the seat without argument. Of course. Madison nodded once, almost as if satisfied by the submission. A younger flight attendant named Daniel stood several feet behind her, holding a tray of sparkling water. He glanced uneasily between Madison and Claire, but remained silent. His hesitation said everything. He knew the treatment was unfair, but he also knew better than to challenge the senior cabin attendant in front of passengers. The injustice lingered heavier precisely because no one stopped it. As the aircraft climbed above the storm clouds, the city lights disappeared beneath thick darkness outside the windows. The cabin settled into a smooth hush broken only by the low hum of engines and the clink of glassware. Claire carefully adjusted Ethan's blanket while he stared sleepily out the window at the glowing moonlight above the clouds. Then, almost absent-mindedly, Claire rested her fingers against the old silver pendant hanging beneath her sweater. She rubbed the wing-shaped emblem once with her thumb, thoughtful and calm. Daniel noticed the gesture immediately. His eyes narrowed slightly again. He had seen that symbol somewhere before. Not in jewelry stores. Somewhere official. Somewhere important. Before he could place it, Madison called sharply from the galley. Daniel. He straightened instantly. Yes, ma'am. The premium dessert cart. Right away. Daniel walked off quickly, though he glanced back at Claire one more time. Across the aisle, the silver-haired businessman leaned toward another passenger and smirked quietly. I give it another hour before she starts asking for free upgrades. Both men chuckled softly. Claire heard them. She heard everything. But instead of reacting, she calmly reached into the navy envelope beside her seat and checked a single document inside. Just one page. Heavy cream paper with gold lettering near the top. Ethan looked up curiously. Mom, is that work stuff? Claire slid the paper back inside carefully. Something like that. Is it important? For the first time all evening, a faint sadness passed across Claire's face. Very important. Madison noticed the envelope again while passing through the aisle. This time she slowed slightly. The gold insignia was visible longer now. Wings surrounding a circular crest. Elegant lettering beneath it. Madison suddenly realized where she had seen it before. Not on ordinary paperwork. In executive portraits hanging inside corporate headquarters during flight attendant training. Her stomach tightened faintly, but almost immediately she dismissed the thought. It was impossible. People connected to airline ownership did not travel dressed like struggling single mothers. They traveled with assistants, security details, luxury handbags, and custom luggage worth more than Claire's entire wardrobe. Still, uncertainty crept quietly into Madison's mind for the first time. To cover it, her tone grew even colder. She stopped beside Claire's seat once more and smiled tightly. Dinner service begins shortly, she announced. Although I should mention some premium selections are reserved first for our priority loyalty guests. Claire met her eyes calmly. That is fine. Madison folded her arms lightly. You seem remarkably comfortable here. Claire tilted her head slightly. Should I not be? The question landed softly. No anger. No embarrassment. Just quiet curiosity. And somehow that unsettled Madison more than any argument possibly could. For a brief second, neither woman looked away. Then Ethan tugged gently on his mother's sleeve. Mom, he whispered, pointing toward the dark sky outside the window. Look at the stars. Claire turned immediately toward him, her entire expression softening. Beautiful, huh? Ethan smiled for the first time since boarding. And as Claire looked out at the endless sky above the clouds, still calm beneath the weight of every judgment in that cabin, Madison Reed suddenly felt the strange and uncomfortable sensation that she might be underestimating the wrong person. The dinner service began 2 hours into the flight as the aircraft cruised steadily above the Atlantic Ocean. Soft piano music drifted through the cabin speakers while warm amber lights reflected across polished silverware and crystal glasses. The atmosphere resembled a private luxury restaurant more than a commercial airplane. Flight attendants moved gracefully between wide leather seats carrying trays of filet mignon, lobster risotto, and imported wine selected for the airline's highest-paying passengers. Every detail of the cabin whispered exclusivity. And seated quietly in the middle of it all, Claire Bennett still looked painfully out of place to everyone around her. Ethan had fallen asleep against the window beneath a thick white blanket, his small hand still clutching the dinosaur-coloring book against his chest. Claire carefully adjusted the blanket around his shoulders before glancing toward the galley where Madison Reed stood reviewing meal orders on her tablet. The older businessman across the aisle accepted his steak with a satisfied nod. The women in cream-colored suits praised the wine pairing loudly enough for nearby passengers to hear. Meanwhile, Claire's tray table remained empty. She waited patiently for several more minutes while every passenger surrounding her received full service. Finally, Daniel approached hesitantly carrying a single tray. His expression looked uncomfortable before he even spoke. Ms. Bennett, he said quietly, I am very sorry, but there appears to have been a problem with your meal selection. Claire looked up calmly. What kind of problem? Daniel glanced toward Madison, standing farther back in the aisle. The remaining premium meals have already been assigned to priority executive members. Several nearby passengers immediately looked over. The silver-haired businessman smirked faintly behind his wine glass. One of the women across the aisle exchanged another knowing glance with her friend. Claire noticed all of it. Still, her expression never changed. I see, she answered softly. Daniel shifted awkwardly. We do have a basic pasta option remaining from economy catering if you would like that instead. The words hung heavily in the elegant cabin. Economy catering. In business class. A few passengers lowered their eyes, embarrassed by the obvious insult even if they lacked the courage to challenge it. Ethan stirred slightly in his sleep beside Claire, but did not wake. Claire looked at Daniel kindly. Thank you. That will be fine. Before Daniel could answer, Madison stepped forward smoothly, her polished smile returning for the audience now quietly watching the exchange. Actually, she interrupted, there is another issue we need to address. The cabin seemed to grow quieter immediately. Madison held her service tablet against her chest and lowered her voice just enough to sound professional while ensuring nearby passengers could still hear every word. There appears to be a discrepancy regarding your booking profile. Claire folded her hands calmly in her lap. A discrepancy? This cabin is generally reserved for our premium corporate clients and elite loyalty travelers, Madison explained carefully. Given the unusual nature of your reservation, we may need to verify your payment authorization after landing. The implications settled over the cabin instantly. Suspicion, doubt, quiet, humiliation disguised as procedure. The businessman across the aisle leaned back with visible satisfaction, as if the situation finally made sense to him. One of the women whispered softly, There it is. Daniel looked horrified. Madison, he began carefully. But Madison continued without looking at him. These things happen occasionally with last-minute purchases. Claire stared at her for several long seconds. Calm, silent, completely unreadable. Then she asked softly, Are you suggesting I do not belong here? Madison gave a practiced smile. I am simply saying this environment can sometimes be confusing for inexperienced travelers. The cruelty was elegant, controlled, sharp enough to wound without ever becoming openly vulgar. Several passengers pretended not to listen now, though every eye remained fixed on Claire. This was the moment Madison expected: embarrassment, maybe anger, maybe defensive explanations about money or status. Instead, Claire slowly reached beside her seat and rested one hand lightly against the navy envelope tucked near the armrest. Her fingers brushed the gold insignia absent-mindedly, as if grounding herself. Then she looked directly at Madison and spoke in a calm voice, so steady it unsettled the entire row. "You know," Claire said quietly, "the interesting thing about first class is that some people think it is about seats." Madison's smile faded slightly. Claire continued softly, "But eventually you learn it is really about how people behave when they believe someone beneath them cannot answer back." Silence spread through the cabin. Even the soft clinking of silverware seemed to stop for a moment. Daniel lowered his eyes immediately. The businessman across the aisle shifted uncomfortably in his seat. One of the women near the window slowly set down her wine glass without speaking. Madison held her posture rigidly, but something uncertain flickered behind her eyes now. Claire had not raised her voice once. She had not argued. She had not defended her wealth or demanded respect. And somehow that made the moment feel far heavier than anger ever could. Ethan stirred again beside her. His sleepy voice barely rose above a whisper. "Mom." Claire immediately turned toward him, her entire expression softening. "I am right here, sweetheart. Are we in trouble?" Several passengers visibly reacted to the question. Claire gently smoothed his hair back from his forehead. "No," she said quietly. "Sometimes people just forget how to treat others kindly." Madison opened her mouth as if preparing another response, but before she could speak, the cabin intercom chimed overhead. "Senior cabin crew, please contact the flight deck." Madison straightened immediately and turned toward the galley. But as she walked away, her eyes drifted once more toward the navy envelope beside Claire's seat. This time the corner had shifted slightly farther open, and for the briefest second, Madison saw something inside that made her pulse stumble. A signature page, corporate seals, and beneath the gold airline insignia, one phrase printed clearly across the document: "Transfer of controlling ownership." Madison froze mid-step, only for a second. Then she quickly forced herself to keep walking toward the cockpit, convincing herself there had to be another explanation. Because if she was wrong about Claire Bennett, then every cold smile, every public slight, every carefully delivered insult over the past 3 hours had just become something far more dangerous than rude. Madison Reed walked briskly toward the forward galley, but the polished confidence she had carried all evening no longer felt steady beneath her feet. The image from the document inside Claire Bennett's navy envelope kept replaying in her mind. Corporate seals, ownership language, transfer authorization. For the first time since boarding began, uncertainty had slipped into her perfectly controlled world. The business cabin behind her remained quiet beneath the soft golden lights. Passengers continued eating expensive dinners from white porcelain plates while pretending not to discuss the scene they had just witnessed. But the atmosphere had changed. The subtle amusement directed at Claire earlier now carried hesitation instead. People were beginning to sense there was something they did not understand. Madison stepped into the galley where Daniel was organizing dessert trays beside the espresso machine. The younger flight attendant glanced up immediately. "Everything okay?" Madison lowered her voice sharply. "Pull up passenger information for seat 2A. Daniel frowned slightly. "Claire Bennett." Madison folded her arms. "Just do it." Daniel tapped carefully across the service tablet mounted near the galley wall. Passenger details appeared across the screen beneath the airline logo. Name, booking information, last-minute reservation, international clearance notes. Then Daniel's expression changed almost instantly. "Wait," he murmured. Madison stepped closer. "What?" Daniel stared at the screen another second. "There is a restricted notation attached to her account." Madison's pulse tightened faintly. "Restricted how?" Daniel hesitated. "Executive review only." Madison gave a short laugh, meant to sound dismissive. "Probably fraud monitoring." But Daniel did not look convinced. He scrolled farther down, then stopped again. "Madison, what now?" Daniel turned the screen slightly toward her. Beneath the standard booking information sat an unusual internal code usually reserved for senior corporate leadership and government travel coordination. Access Priority Alpha. Madison stared at it silently. She had worked international premium cabins for 15 years. Very few passengers ever carried Alpha authorization status, and the ones who did were never ordinary travelers. There has to be a mistake, she said quickly. Daniel lowered his voice further. I do not think so. Before Madison could respond, the galley phone rang sharply overhead. Daniel answered first. Business cabin, Daniel speaking. His posture straightened almost immediately. Yes, Captain. Madison watched his face carefully as he listened. Understood. Daniel slowly lowered the receiver. The flight deck wants confirmation on Ms. Bennett's comfort level during the flight. Madison blinked once. What? The captain specifically asked if she has requested anything additional. Silence settled briefly inside the galley except for the soft hum of refrigeration units and distant engine noise beyond the cabin walls. Madison forced a tight smile. Well, that is unusual. Daniel stared at her carefully. The captain never calls personally about passengers. Madison straightened her uniform jacket quickly, rebuilding the polished authority slipping from her grasp. Fine, she said coolly. Someone in corporate probably flagged her reservation because of the transfer paperwork. Transfer paperwork? Daniel asked quietly. Madison realized too late she had spoken aloud. Nothing. But Daniel's curiosity was fully awake now. Across the cabin, Claire sat quietly beside Ethan, who had finally woken enough to eat a small bowl of pasta Daniel had personally brought over after the earlier humiliation. Outside the windows, moonlight stretched endlessly across dark clouds thousands of feet below them. The cabin lights had dimmed further now, casting long soft shadows across polished wood panels and leather seats. Claire looked peaceful despite everything that had happened. Almost too peaceful. One of the women who had mocked her earlier glanced repeatedly toward the navy envelope resting beside Claire's seat pocket. Her curiosity had replaced superiority now. Even the silver-haired businessman across the aisle no longer looked amused. He looked cautious. Claire noticed the shift immediately, but said nothing. She simply opened Ethan's blanket more carefully around his shoulders before quietly checking the time on an old silver watch hidden beneath her sleeve. The watch looked simple at first glance, but the engraving on its face carried the same winged crest as the pendant around her neck and the envelope beside her seat. Daniel approached slowly with freshwater glasses. This time his posture toward Claire was entirely different. Respectful. Careful. Ms. Bennett, he said quietly. Is there anything else I can bring you tonight? Claire smiled politely. No, thank you. You have already been very kind. Daniel nodded once, though his eyes drifted briefly toward the envelope. If you need anything at all, please let me know personally. Madison watched the exchange from the galley entrance, irritation tightening beneath her ribs. Daniel was changing his behavior too quickly. She hated that. The uncertainty spreading through the cabin felt dangerous because uncertainty weakened authority. So Madison did what people like her often did when they sensed control slipping away. She doubled down. She stepped back into the aisle, carrying herself even straighter than before. Ladies and gentlemen, she announced warmly to nearby passengers, we will begin our overnight turn-down service shortly. Her voice regained some confidence as wealthy travelers smiled politely back at her. This was her environment, her cabin, her world. Then she stopped beside Claire once more. Ms. Bennett, she said smoothly, I do hope the confusion earlier did not make you uncomfortable. Claire looked up calmly. Not at all. Madison tilted her head slightly. Good. International business travel can sometimes create misunderstandings for passengers unfamiliar with premium procedures. The sentence was elegant, polished, but still cruel. Daniel visibly stiffened nearby. Claire simply folded her hands together and met Madison's eyes without blinking. That is true, she answered softly. And sometimes people mistake quietness for weakness. Madison's expression froze almost invisibly. Claire's voice never rose. Yet every word seemed to settle heavily into the silence around them. Several nearby passengers looked away immediately, suddenly unwilling to participate in the judgment anymore. Then the cabin phone rang again from the galley. This time Madison answered herself. Senior Attendant Reed speaking. Her professional smile vanished almost instantly. Yes, sir. She listened silently for several long seconds while the color slowly drained from her face. Understood. When she lowered the receiver, her hand no longer looked entirely steady. Daniel stared at her. What happened? Madison swallowed once before answering quietly. Corporate headquarters just transmitted a priority notice. About who? Madison's eyes drifted slowly toward Claire Bennett sitting peacefully beside her sleeping son beneath the soft golden cabin lights. About her. The moment Claire Bennett spoke the chairman's name, the entire business cabin seemed to stop breathing. Even the steady hum of the aircraft engines felt distant beneath the sudden silence stretching through the rows of leather seats and dim amber lights. Madison Reed stood frozen beside the tray table, her polished composure visibly cracking for the first time all evening. Across the aisle, the silver-haired businessman slowly lowered his wine glass. One of the women near the window stared openly now, no longer pretending not to listen. Daniel remained motionless near the galley entrance, his eyes locked on the silver executive key resting beside the transfer documents. Claire, meanwhile, looked completely calm. "Good evening, Richard," she repeated softly into the phone. "I apologize for the late call." A warm, older voice answered immediately through the speaker loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. "Claire, thank God. We have been trying to reach you for the last hour." Madison's face lost more color instantly. Claire glanced briefly toward Ethan sleeping peacefully beside the window before answering. "We were in the air." "Of course," Richard Lawson replied quickly. "I assume the transfer package reached you safely?" Several passengers exchanged stunned looks. Claire rested one hand lightly against the navy envelope. "It did." Richard's voice softened noticeably. "Then tomorrow morning, after your signature clears in London, Bennett Aviation Holdings officially becomes the majority owner of Atlantic Crown Airways." The cabin went completely silent. Not quiet. Silent. Absolute stillness settled over every row as the meaning landed all at once. Claire Bennett was not simply connected to the airline. She was about to own it. Madison stared at Claire as if seeing her for the first time. The faded cardigan, the worn sneakers, the old silver pendant hidden beneath the sweater. None of it matched the image Madison had built in her mind about power and wealth. And yet suddenly every strange detail from the evening made terrifying sense. The alpha authorization, the executive key, the chairman's direct calls, the transfer documents. Daniel swallowed hard beside the galley wall. Even the wealthy passengers surrounding Claire now looked visibly unsettled by how badly they had misjudged her. Richard continued speaking through the phone. "Your father would have been incredibly proud tonight, Claire." Claire lowered her eyes briefly toward the silver wing pendant around her neck. For the first time all evening, emotion flickered softly across her face. "Thank you, Richard. The board unanimously approved the acquisition after reviewing your humanitarian expansion proposal," Richard continued warmly. Nobody expected the daughter of the original founder to return quietly after all these years and save the company. One of the women across the aisle covered her mouth slightly in disbelief. Founder's daughter. Save the company. Madison's breathing had become shallow now. Claire spoke gently into the phone. "I did not do it to save the company." She glanced toward Ethan sleeping peacefully beside her. "I did it because airlines forgot how people deserve to be treated." Those words settled through the cabin heavier than any accusation could have. Nobody looked at Madison now. Nobody needed to. The shame had already filled the room on its own. Richard cleared his throat softly on the line. "There is one more thing. Corporate notified me about concerns regarding your onboard experience tonight." Madison's stomach dropped completely. Claire remained composed. "It has been a long evening." Richard's tone sharpened slightly. "Claire, if anyone made you uncomfortable, I need names." Every eye in the cabin shifted instantly toward Madison Reed. She stood perfectly still beside the tray table, unable to hide the panic slowly overtaking her expression. Her confidence, her polished superiority, her carefully controlled cabin authority had collapsed entirely within seconds. Claire looked at Madison quietly for a long moment before answering. "I think some people made assumptions." Richard sounded furious now. "That is unacceptable." Claire's voice stayed calm. "People reveal themselves under pressure, Richard." The sentence landed softly, but the weight behind it was devastating. She was not insulting anyone. She was simply stating a truth no one in that cabin could deny anymore. Richard exhaled slowly on the line. "Understood." Then his voice warmed again. "Your car and security team will meet you directly on arrival in London. The board is preparing tomorrow's press announcement now." "Thank you." "And Claire." "Yes." Welcome home. The call ended quietly. Nobody moved afterward. Nobody spoke. The cabin remained suspended inside one enormous moment of realization. Claire calmly placed her phone beside the documents and gently adjusted Ethan's blanket again, as if nothing extraordinary had happened. But around her, everything had changed. The businessman across the aisle looked deeply embarrassed now. One of the women who had mocked Claire earlier slowly looked away toward the dark window, unable to meet her eyes. Daniel stepped forward carefully. "Ms. Bennett," he said softly, almost respectfully now. "Is there anything at all I can do for you?" Claire smiled faintly. "My son is asleep. That is enough." Daniel nodded immediately. Of course. Madison still had not spoken. Her hands remained clasped tightly in front of her uniform, as if holding herself together physically. Finally, she managed to force out a quiet sentence. "You are Claire Bennett." It was not really a question anymore. Claire looked up at her calmly. "Yes." Madison blinked several times, struggling to reconcile the simple woman she had humiliated with the reality now sitting in front of her. "You are buying the airline." Claire shook her head gently. "No." She glanced once toward the silver pendant resting against her collarbone. "I am bringing my family's airline back." The distinction hit harder than anger ever could. Because Claire did not sound proud. She sounded sincere, quiet, human. That was what made the moment unbearable for Madison Reed. The woman she had spent the entire flight judging by appearances had possessed more grace, more patience, and more dignity than anyone else in the cabin from the very beginning. And now every person around them understood it. For several long minutes after the truth came out, nobody in the business cabin seemed to know how to behave anymore. The same passengers who had quietly judged Claire Bennett from the moment she stepped on board now avoided looking directly at her. The atmosphere that once felt polished and exclusive had become heavy with embarrassment instead. Soft piano music still drifted through the overhead speakers. Crystal glasses still reflected the amber cabin lights. The aircraft still moved steadily above the Atlantic night sky. But something deeper had changed inside that cabin. People were no longer looking at Claire's worn sneakers or faded cardigan. They were looking at themselves. Madison Reed stood frozen beside the aisle, her perfectly trained posture slowly collapsing beneath the weight of everything she had said throughout the flight. The cold professionalism she once carried like armor had disappeared completely now. In its place stood a woman suddenly forced to confront the reality of her own behavior in front of an entire cabin full of witnesses. Daniel quietly stepped beside her. "Madison," he whispered carefully, "the captain wants to speak with you in the galley." She barely reacted. Her eyes remained fixed on Claire. Finally, she managed to speak, though her voice sounded smaller than anyone had heard all evening. "Ms. Bennett." "I did not realize." Claire looked at her calmly. "No," she answered softly. "You did not." There was no anger in her tone. Somehow that made the moment even harder to bear. Madison swallowed hard. "I owe you an apology." Nearby passengers listened silently now. No one interrupted. No one defended her. Claire glanced toward Ethan sleeping peacefully against the window before answering. "You do not owe me luxury treatment." Madison lowered her eyes slightly. Claire continued gently. "But you did owe basic kindness." The sentence landed across the cabin with quiet force. One of the women in cream-colored suits slowly removed her glasses and stared down at her untouched wine. The silver-haired businessman shifted again in visible discomfort. Earlier they had laughed. Earlier, they had watched the humiliation unfold without saying a word. Now nobody seemed proud of their silence anymore. Madison's composure cracked further. "You are right," she admitted quietly. "I judged you the second you boarded." Claire nodded once. Most people did. Daniel looked deeply embarrassed hearing that. Madison inhaled slowly. "I thought." She hesitated, struggling to finish the sentence. Claire saved her from it. "You thought simple clothes meant simple value." The cabin remained completely still. Madison could not deny it. Because that was exactly what she had believed. Claire rested one hand gently against the old silver pendant around her neck. "My father used to fly economy on purpose sometimes," she said softly. Several passengers looked up immediately. He believed the only way to understand a company was to see how ordinary people were treated when nobody important was watching. Madison's eyes widened faintly. Claire smiled sadly. Tonight proved he was right. Daniel lowered his head. Even the passengers who had never spoken directly to Claire now looked ashamed simply for participating in the atmosphere surrounding her. A few rows back, one older woman quietly removed the expensive scarf from around her neck and folded it carefully into her lap, as though material things suddenly felt meaningless. The intercom chimed softly overhead. Senior cabin attendant Reed, please contact the flight deck immediately. This time the announcement carried an unmistakable seriousness. Madison closed her eyes briefly before nodding once. Yes, Captain. But before she could leave, Claire spoke again. Madison. She stopped instantly. Claire's voice remained calm. I am not interested in humiliating you. Madison slowly turned back. Claire looked directly at her. I just hope the next person dressed simply receives a different experience. The words hit harder than punishment ever could have, because Claire was offering dignity even after being denied it herself. Madison's eyes filled slightly, though she quickly looked away. I understand. Claire gave a small nod. Good. Madison walked toward the galley slowly this time, no longer carrying herself like the unquestioned authority of the cabin. The passengers watched her go in complete silence. Then something unexpected happened. The silver-haired businessman across the aisle cleared his throat awkwardly and leaned toward Claire. Ms. Bennett, he said quietly, I owe you an apology as well. Claire looked at him politely. For what? The man glanced down embarrassed. For assuming things about you before I knew anything about you. Claire studied him for a moment before answering softly. That happens more often than people admit. The woman near the window spoke next. Your son seems very sweet. Claire's expression softened immediately. He is. Slowly, one by one, the atmosphere around Claire changed completely. Not because she was wealthy. Not because she was about to own the airline. But because the entire cabin had witnessed the difference between status and character in real time. Daniel returned carrying a fresh blanket and carefully placed it beside Ethan without disturbing him. The captain asked me to personally ensure you are comfortable for the rest of the flight, he said respectfully. Claire smiled faintly. Thank you, Daniel. He hesitated briefly before speaking again. For what it is worth, ma'am, not everyone agreed with how you were treated tonight. Claire nodded gently. I know. Outside the windows, moonlight stretched endlessly across the clouds below, like silver waves beneath the aircraft. The cabin lights dimmed further as passengers slowly settled into silence again. But the silence felt different now. Earlier it had been filled with judgment. Now it carried reflection instead. Claire leaned back quietly in her seat, while Ethan slept peacefully against her shoulder. The old silver pendant rested softly against her sweater beneath the warm amber lights. She could have embarrassed everyone in that cabin. She could have demanded consequences immediately. She could have used power the way many powerful people did. Instead, she chose restraint, grace, perspective, and somewhere above the Atlantic Ocean, inside a cabin once obsessed with appearances and status, a group of strangers were forced to confront a truth far bigger than luxury seats or corporate titles. Real class had never been sitting in first class. Real class was how someone treated people when they believed there was nothing to gain from kindness. By the time the aircraft began its descent into London, the atmosphere inside the business cabin no longer resembled the same flight that had left New York hours earlier. The cold superiority, the quiet laughter, the dismissive glances toward Claire Bennett had vanished completely. In their place lingered something far heavier. Reflection, embarrassment, respect. Outside the windows, the first pale streaks of morning sunlight stretched across the clouds beneath the aircraft, turning the horizon silver and gold. Inside the cabin, most passengers sat quietly awake, though very few touched the expensive breakfasts arranged neatly before them. Every so often, someone glanced toward Claire sitting peacefully beside her sleeping son near the front row. She had not changed her clothes. She had not demanded attention. She had not lectured anyone. Yet somehow she had become the most powerful presence on the plane simply by remaining calm while everyone else revealed themselves. Madison Reed had barely spoken for the last 2 hours. After her conversation with the captain, she moved through the cabin silently, her earlier confidence completely gone. For the first time in years, she understood what real shame felt like. Not public humiliation, something deeper. The realization that she had looked directly at another human being and reduced their worth to clothing, posture, and assumptions. And worse, she had done it while believing she represented excellence. As the seatbelt sign illuminated overhead, passengers slowly returned their seats upright. Ethan rubbed his eyes sleepily and looked out the window at the glowing sunrise above London. "Mom," he whispered softly, "did we make it?" Claire smiled gently and brushed his hair back. "Almost." Ethan looked around the unusually quiet cabin. "Why is everybody staring at us?" A few nearby passengers immediately looked away, embarrassed at being caught. Claire answered softly, "Sometimes people think more carefully after a long night." Ethan nodded, as if that somehow made perfect sense. Daniel approached quietly, carrying 2 fresh cups of hot chocolate. "For landing," he said warmly. Claire smiled. "Thank you." Daniel hesitated before speaking again. "Ms. Bennett, I wanted to say something before we arrive." Claire looked up calmly. "Go ahead." Daniel glanced briefly toward Madison, standing farther down the aisle near the galley. "A lot of us joined this airline because we believed it stood for dignity. Somewhere along the way, I think people forgot that." Claire studied him thoughtfully for a moment. "Companies do not lose values overnight," she said softly. "They lose them one small decision at a time." Daniel nodded slowly. The words clearly stayed with him. Then he surprised her. "If you really are taking over the airline," Claire raised an eyebrow slightly. Daniel smiled faintly. "I hope you bring those values back." Claire looked out the window toward the sunrise for several quiet seconds before answering. "That is the plan." As the aircraft descended lower through the clouds, the captain's voice came calmly over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we will be landing shortly at Heathrow Airport. Local time is 6:23 in the morning. On behalf of Atlantic Crown Airways, thank you for flying with us tonight." He paused briefly before continuing. "And a special welcome home to Ms. Claire Bennett." The cabin froze once more. Then slowly, quietly, several passengers began clapping. Not loudly, not dramatically, just sincere applause spreading row by row through the cabin. The silver-haired businessman clapped first. Then the woman in the cream-colored suit joined in. Even passengers who had never spoken to Claire now looked at her differently. Not because of wealth, not because of ownership papers, but because they had watched Grace hold its dignity under pressure all night long. Claire looked genuinely surprised by the applause. She gave only a small nod in return before helping Ethan fasten his seatbelt again. Madison stood motionless near the galley, watching the scene silently. When the wheels finally touched the runway with a soft thunder beneath the cabin floor, the applause faded into quiet reflection once more. The aircraft taxied slowly toward the terminal beneath the gray London dawn. Outside, black executive vehicles already waited near the private arrival entrance. Security personnel stood beside them in dark coats while airport officials moved quickly along the tarmac. Ethan pressed his face gently against the window. "Mom, are all those cars for us?" Claire smiled softly. "Something like that." Once the aircraft reached the gate, the seatbelt signs switched off and passengers began gathering their belongings quietly. But nobody rushed ahead of Claire. Nobody pushed past her. The same people who once viewed her as someone who did not belong now stepped aside respectfully as she stood in the aisle, holding Ethan's hand. Madison finally approached her one last time. Her voice was quiet now. "Honest. Ms. Bennett, I know an apology cannot erase tonight." Claire met her eyes calmly. "No," she answered gently. "But learning from it matters." Madison nodded slowly, emotion visible in her face for the first time. "I will remember that." Claire adjusted the navy envelope beneath her arm and gave a small respectful nod in return. Then she turned toward Daniel. "Thank you for choosing kindness when it mattered." Daniel looked genuinely moved. "Safe travels, Miss Bennett." Claire and Ethan began walking slowly toward the aircraft door while the cabin watched in complete silence. The old silver pendant rested softly against her sweater. The transfer documents remained tucked beneath her arm. Her worn sneakers moved quietly across the carpeted aisle where hours earlier she had been treated like she did not belong. At the doorway, Ethan looked up at his mother. "Mom." "Yes." "Why were people mean before?" Claire paused for a moment before answering. "Because sometimes people see clothes before they see character." Ethan thought about that seriously. "That is silly." Claire smiled faintly. "It is." Then she took his hand and stepped through the aircraft door into the pale London morning where the waiting executives, security team, and black cars stood silently outside. Behind her, an entire cabin full of strangers remained seated longer than necessary, watching the quiet woman in faded jeans walk away carrying more dignity than anyone else they had met all night. And somewhere deep inside that silent aircraft, People who once believed luxury was about status finally understood what real class actually looked like.